Hello and welcome to Thinkpod, powered by the FII Institute. I'm your host, Mark Barton, and for over 2 decades, I've been at the forefront of global conversations on the issues that matter the most. In this series, I'll be meeting the leaders who are rising to tackle the grand challenges that face humanity right now. Together, we'll be discussing the radical ideas and the transformative solutions that'll benefit both people and planet. In this episode, we're joined by Lieutenant General Sir Simon Mayall, the UK's first Defence Senior Advisor Middle East, and now a Senior Advisor to Greenhill. We discuss why the West's 30-year holiday from history is over, how Western preconceptions of the broader Middle East lead to bad foreign policy, and why the next generation of ambitious, educated youth are a cause for optimism. Simon, thank you very much for joining us today.
Great pleasure.
We seem globally, Simon, to be at let's call it an inflection point, mid-post pandemic and the economic implications of it. Food insecurity, energy security, inflation, geopolitical tensions. From your standpoint, how do you view that myriad of conflicts?
I think it's a very fragile time at the moment. I think it's worrying and very complicated for policymakers. 2 great powers, one, China and Russia, have to an extent began to exempt themselves from the rules-based international order. Other countries are under huge pressure from inflation. Clearly, the pandemic still rolls on across certain parts of the world, differing objectives. Supply lines shortened. And what does also worry me is a lack of confidence in leaders. There's an awful lot of churn in Western societies at the moment. Predated the COVID, predated Ukraine.
How do you view America's levels of engagement with the world? A couple of years ago, under the previous president, there seemed to be a pullback from the world. Right now, under President Biden, do you sense a United States that's at least in some part willing to engage or engaging in a different way?
Well, I'm a great supporter of the transatlantic link. I'm a great supporter of American leadership. I can't see anybody else I'd rather be providing that leadership. And unfortunately, since the invasion of Iraq back and the failed occupation, or the mishandled occupation, America has lost, I think, a degree of credibility, a degree of reputational credibility around the world, degree of self-confidence. Clearly, blood and treasure spilt there. And the assumptions we had about American leadership, even those who are deeply committed to that link and that leadership, have been weakened. And I think in other parts of the world, I always used to say, you can always surge men, tanks, ships, etc. What you can't often surge in relationships is trust. And I think that has been weakened. So I welcome American re-engagement hugely, particularly catalyzed by Ukraine. I'm a great supporter of NATO.
If you looked at NATO 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I mean, NATO was dead. Would you concur?
Well, part of it was because of the weakening of American leadership. I think one should never, ever underestimate the importance of America's commitment to NATO, which is why I'm so very anti and skeptical about European initiatives to try and replace that. And what Mr. Putin has done, of course, is suddenly remind people that, our holiday from history, as I might call it, is over. Great power, not just competition, but conflict is resurgent. And when you really look around, as you do, it's like people criticizing the police. Trust me, if there's a riot, you want a well-equipped, well-trained police force, which we have. If we've got an international riot, which we have at the moment, thanks to Russia, you look around, who's there? NATO, without its bedrock.
Elaborate on that holiday from history.
The 2 great seminal works of the late 1980s, early 1990s were, of course, Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and the Last Man, and, of course, Samuel Huntington, Clash of Civilizations. And too many people wanted to believe what Huntington said. Now, he's an academic. He can't take responsibility for what policymakers and politicians derive from his writing. But he largely said, we have won all the great battles about individual freedoms and collective freedoms and liberal democracy and the globalized state. And Huntington said, just be really careful. Whenever you look back through history, you will find issues of identity, religion, ethnicity, individual leaders will come behind you and cross you over the back of the head. So I've always said a 30-year holiday from history where we believed our own hype because it suited us to. Because governments, and I don't say just Western governments, decided they could go ahead with bribing people with their own money and dare I say, not putting money into things like intelligence, border security, police, justice systems, and of course defence, which ultimately underpinned the security on which every other aspect of modern society requires to be based.
How would you label this period of history then? I mean, it's beginning to be written. It's a new chapter. Maybe it's a new book. What's the title of this book?
History is always written backwards, inevitably. Some people are quite good at prophesying. Lots of people make a lot of money out of, venturing to say which way the future goes. And 9 times out of 10, they're wrong. And then some people write afterwards and say, we should have spotted this coming. I would have argued we should have spotted this coming.
Were you warning?
Yes, I think I was, yeah. And I think most of us in the security arena would have warned and said we are not building resilience or robustness into our
And what was
societies.
the retort to the warning?
Well, it's just got to be very clear, and sometimes one explains it to audiences, say in the Middle East, about we can all understand our national self-interest, but when you're on a democratic electoral cycles of 4, which is basically 2 years, it's very difficult to commit to long-term strategic objectives. The messiness of democracy makes it very, very difficult to make that case to a public on a long enough sustained basis that will allow you to really turn the supertanker around. And you're always slightly out of sync. American politics are in this sort of cycle, European politics, French, German, British, and then you're slightly out of sync on the economic cycle as well. So it's a comment, not criticism, but it does sometimes make it very difficult.
I like that, the messiness of politics. Before we forget, because we've got so much to discuss, come back to NATO. You've stressed we need NATO, we need a strong NATO. Clearly, the expansion of NATO is an ever-present topic. Where does that expansion lead us in terms of ramifications and threats from maybe outside parties?
Just thinking back to the outbreak of the Second World War, rather, where Britain offered security guarantees to Poland, that it was not, frankly, in a position to, it was a check they weren't in a position to cash.
Yeah.
So you've got to be quite careful when you go out and offer security guarantees that your bluff isn't called. The vulnerability of those promises was very firmly revealed in Georgia and obviously in Ukraine. Now, some people say if Ukraine had been part of NATO, Putin wouldn't have moved, but equally, you don't import people's security problems into what is fundamentally a defensive alliance, because you've then got to turn around to your citizens and say, we are committed to war by virtue of this alliance. Are you with us? And going back to, again, American leadership, there was a huge moment, which again probably was not as significant in people's eyes as it was for many of us, when we failed to cross the red line in Syria in 2013. And, like anything in life, bullying the school ground, if you set a red line, you've really got to know that you've got the willingness to if somebody crosses the red line, whichever way, that you're going to carry out your threats.
Have lessons been learned from that very famous red line?
The worry is that the lesson is don't set a red line, rather than set a red line and stick to
what you've actually...
Absolutely.
Very quickly, before we go on to the MENA region, Germany and the should we call it framing birth of the European defence architecture. Discuss.
Germany, one can be critical of American retrenchment, but Germany did characterize those countries in Europe who had been very nobly, their security and their economy being supported by American guarantees. And president after president has said, please, we are paying 90% of all military expenditure within NATO. Will you Europeans step up to the plate as well? And Germany, who had most to gain in the Cold War from that security, arguably most to gain after unification and in the New World Order with the Russian Federation, should have been the first one to have the honesty to say, we must fulfill our obligations. And Germany categorically didn't, year after year after year. It failed to step up to the plate. And on the other hand, the other great supposed founding father of European defense, of course, was the French. And the French actively tried to push the Americans away. So the importance of Britain in keeping, going back to an earlier question, in keeping America engaged at a time when the politics were not conducive to sustaining that grouping of like-minded, democratically inclined countries that had been so powerfully displayed during the Cold War, was in danger of splitting. Hence the significance of the coming together. And Germany rediscovering the realities of security, that none of their comfortable lifestyle or their booming manufacturing economy is worth a pinch of salt if, frankly, you've got a major aggressive power very close on your doorstep.
How blown away were you by this complete change in Germany's defense thinking?
It is quite remarkable. Going back to holiday from history.
Yeah.
Germany and Russia have been like that for centuries, really. The most recent clash, of course, Second World War, most ghastly sort of episode in military history on the Russian front. And then, of course, for years, facing off across the inner-German border. I was staggered, not so much that Germany has rediscovered a sort of backbone on this, but I was staggered that Germany had economically, through the energy equation, put itself almost totally vulnerable to whatever happened in Russia. I find that quite remarkable.
Let's talk about the Middle East and North Africa, Simon, because that's where your wonderful expertise can enlighten us and educate us as well. The Abraham Accords were almost 2 years on. How would you categorize the security situation in the region in the wake of those accords right now?
Well, it was quite useful to get the Arab-Israeli equation into a slightly different place. I don't think it's remotely solved. As we know, the whole issue of the Palestinians in West Bank, Gaza, settlers will continue to be a very useful, let alone the reality of it, is a very useful stick with which other players in the region can beat up all sorts of other players, including within the region. The big issue at the moment, to my mind, remains some macro issues, climate change, water resources, some of the volatility that we still see in places like Libya and the like, is the issue of Iran.
Yeah.
And the big problem of the failed occupation of Iraq was that by removing Saddam, we gave Iran an opportunity to join up Shia co-religionists through Iraq, through Syria, out to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so on the one hand, you've got Iranian interference in areas across the Middle East that are based on old ethnic divides between Persians and Arabs, clearly a confessional divide between Sunni and Shia, and clearly Iran's determination to play almost an old-fashioned imperial, certainly regional role. And that would be difficult enough anyway without the GCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and the whole nuclear file. So in some ways, that is, to my mind, is the macro issue.
Yeah.
So, and the response might come from Turkey.
Yeah.
It could easily come from Egypt. It could certainly come from Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states. It could certainly come from Israel. It could certainly come from America, certainly in support of Israel, maybe other allied nations. So the capacity for Iran to be big enough to cause a lot of policymakers a lot of problems, I think is really quite critical at the moment.
On the nuclear front, how do we unstall the talks with Iran?
Well, they've been running for a long time, as you know, in Vienna. What's interesting at the moment is also there are some parallel talks between the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians held in Iraq. So interesting conversations taking place around the core element. The Vienna talks are largely based around the issue of the nuclear program, stalling it, making it more verifiable, new inspection regime, no more enrichment. People in the Gulf, which would include Israel, but Arab nations as well particularly, want this to be more comprehensive. They want it to be about Iranian interference, malign interference in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, obviously threat to Israel. And they'd actually also like the issue of ballistic missiles to be addressed. So in some ways, the GCPOA talks in Vienna could come up with one answer, but wouldn't by any means solve everybody else's concern.
You're suggesting it's irresolvable?
I'm not. I'm probably suggesting at the moment the issue of Iran overall is irresolvable in the sense it will continue to go on under the current regime.
You're a history man.
I always love going back into history.
Please do, because it's important on this.
Some of these.
It's important. Explain the history.
Across the Middle East, the most sort of fractious part of the Middle East, Mesopotamia probably, birthplace of civilization. At one stage, absolutely dominated by the Iranians under the Achaemenids. It was dominated by the Arabs, of course, under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, dominated by the Mamluks in many ways, the Egyptians, under the pharaohs as well, dominated by the Ottomans. So when you take the modern countries of Turkey, of Iran, of Saudi Arabia, of Egypt, all of them have a degree of what I call historical inspiration and historical grievance and historical entitlement to interfere, be influential in those parts. And those pressure points are still playing out. And of course, then you throw in on top of that the engagement of the West.
To what extent are all these issues which you've wonderfully articulated, to what extent are all these divisions in the region insurmountable?
Well, I think the great cry is you've got to go in there with a very healthy dose of realism about what is achievable. And I do think a knowledge of history, a knowledge of culture, an investment in languages, an investment in personal relationships is really important. And I think one thing that drives the Iranians really mad in many ways is how much they are viewed, certainly by the Americans, through the prism of 1979 and the hostage situation, the overthrow of the Shah. And so that, for the Americans, to an extent, sums up what they know about Iran. And Iran has this idea that it is the nation or the empire of Xerxes, Cyrus the Great, Darius, the Achaemenids, domination of the whole Western world as we knew it at that stage. And this idea that they are defined means that when you attack the Iranian regime, all the Iranians feel a sense of cultural identity and so close in. So all I'll say is if one doesn't understand where these lines come from, if one doesn't understand the shockwave of the collapse of the caliphate from the death of Muhammad, the prophet, to the last caliph thrown out by Ataturk and the foundation of modern Turkey, you just are going to thrash around a bit.
Is there another prism we can sort of bring into play to make the world see Iran in a different way?
Yes, well, it's interesting now Iran opening up. I think what is interesting going on in Saudi Arabia at the moment, many people will watch with both interest and admiration a lot of the reforms, a lot of the liberalisation. We've got to be careful. We saw what happened with the Shah. Speed is important, must be managed within the, go with the grain of the country. But what is interesting is with very young populations, I think something which, again, many of your listeners will know.
Yes.
Across the region, an average age of 22 compared to an average age of 44 in Western Europe. People's access to that mean that as certain cultural, social, economic, political developments take place on one side of the Arabian Gulf, the people on the other side, the Iranians, would be looking and saying, how come we aren't having these sort of freedoms? How come this reform movement is stalled with our leadership? That could be a very interesting dynamic to look at. The genie is out of the bottle on certain social issues in a way that would have been difficult to imagine 10 years ago.
And what are you saying here? Where does that lead if I pull that thread?
Well, I look at someone like Egypt with 100 million people, but not many natural resources. So you're generating loads of people whose aspirations and ambitions are quite difficult to fulfill or meet. In the Gulf region, where there is money because of the energy equation, fossil fuels still, which will continue to be there, there is a chance for enlightened rulers to sort of, as it were, buy time to gradually move forward a reform agenda to diversify economy. Now, Iran could be one of those countries which could move on that track because it has such cultural depth. It has such an ambitious, educated, aspirational young population. And it might be inspired, interestingly, in a way we might not have seen before, by some of the changes that are taking place in other parts of the Muslim world, but where the ethnicity and the confessional dynamic is different.
So interesting what you were saying about Iran and the younger generation, and it leads to my next question about the younger generation in the region. How are the younger generation, the sub-30-year-olds, how are they shaping the socio-political and economic landscape? I mean, are you encouraged?
I am. Interestingly, though, I was very skeptical during the Arab Spring because I could absolutely see why a lot of people wanted to overthrow Mubarak, Gaddafi, etc. But everybody took as their prism again the fall of the Berlin Wall. And it looked like a lot of very fresh-faced, young, energetic men and women demanding reform. But it was very different for, the basis of what we know, the religious basis, the social conservatism of the region. So I was very skeptical about the Arab Spring turning out well. But it's another turn of history. And I think, again, easy to generalize in the Middle East, the Gulf states have a different dynamic.
Why?
I think because, again, they've managed the stewardship of their natural resources much better. There's been a lot more empowerment of people through the tribal system and the monarchical system, patriarchal that may look to outsiders. And I think they have the capacity to diversify, hopefully quickly enough, to absorb the energy of the youth coming up.
Simon, we've been spoilt by your insight. Thank you so much indeed.
Huge pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.
In these turbulent times, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to ThinkPod for more insight and analysis.